The combat tracker stopped 6 meters from Dusk and would not come closer. That was the part none of them had prepared for. Not the junior detail, who'd spent the better part of an hour building their case. Not the senior officer, who'd signed the retrieval order with the particular satisfaction of someone who had never once been wrong. Not the handler on the other end of the tracker's lead, a Vrethian specialist in the kind of body armor that makes a statement before its owner opens his mouth. None of them had planned for a classified apex-grade animal, certified, decorated, the thing post security kept in a sealed bay and brought out only when everything else had failed. To walk into a cargo processing room, scent the air twice, and sit down on the floor like it had decided that was enough. Dusk didn't even lift his head. He was lying on his side under my chair, the way he always did when I had paperwork, his gray muzzle resting on my boot. His eyes were open. He'd already looked at the tracker when it came through the door, the way he looked at most things. A single unhurried assessment, and then he'd looked away, which I knew. You from 11 years of working alongside him meant he'd concluded there was nothing in the room worth the energy of standing. He was not wrong. I went back to the manifest. The trouble had started 2 hours earlier, when I'd arrived at Waypost Kareth 9 for a routine supply review. Civilian contractor, standard transit documentation, one declared animal, working dog, retired, non-commercial. Dusk had done this 100 times. He walked through the scanner at my left knee, sat when I stopped, moved when I moved. The junior detail at the processing gate were Vrethian, 3 of them, young in the way that expresses itself as volume. The one doing the talking had the collar markings of a second-tier certifier. Not nothing, not much. He looked at Dusk the way people sometimes do when they see a big dog moving slow, muzzle gone silver, taking his time on the ramp, as though the slowness is a flaw, evidence of something diminished. He said the animal appeared to be in compromised physical condition and represented a documentation irregularity. His words. He had a good command of the trade common dialect, and he used it precisely, the way people do when they want to sound like the paperwork is already filed. I told him Dusk was 11 years old, certified search and rescue K9, tired from active service 4 years ago, and that the documentation irregularity he was describing was a standard senior animal transit classification that had been accepted at 47 posts in the last 3 years without incident. I was not unfriendly about it. I have been doing this a long time. He asked if I was aware that Waypost Kareth 9 maintained its own standards. I said I was aware of that, yes. He said that, under Kareth 9's Animal Transit Supplemental, any animal exhibiting signs of physical degradation could be held for veterinary assessment, and that, pending assessment, the animal would be transferred to the Waypost's holding facility. I looked at him for a moment. Dusk was sitting beside me, doing nothing, which is most of what Dusk does these days. He was watching the 3 of them with the particular quality of attention he has. Not aggressive, not submissive, just awake. The same look he gave, the collapsed mine shaft in the Cascades the morning he found the 2 surveyors who'd been missing for 60 hours. He was simply watching, recording, assigning each thing its proper weight. I told the certifier that I would like to speak with the duty officer before any transfer proceeded. The certifier told me the duty officer had already been notified. The duty officer was a Vrethian senior named Orvesh Tan Kaleth, who had the measured quality of someone accustomed to being the largest authority in a room. He reviewed my documentation with genuine attention, which I respected, and then he told me that while my paperwork was in order, the supplemental provision was also valid, and that his junior detail had exercised it correctly. I asked what the veterinary concern was specifically. He said the animal was visibly aged, that its gait showed reduced mobility, and that under Vrethian Animal Transit Code, reduced mobility in a declared working animal constituted grounds for fitness review. I told him Dusk was not a working animal anymore. He was a retired animal. There was a difference in the transit classification, which was reflected in the documentation. Fiesh Tan Kaleth told me he understood the distinction, and that the supplemental applied regardless. Then he told me he was going to bring in the Waypost's assessment specialist, and that the specialist would determine whether the animal presented any risk profile that the documentation hadn't captured. He said it in the tone of someone doing me a courtesy, explaining a process, nothing more. I said that was fine. I didn't tell him what the assessment specialist would find. I didn't see any reason to. Keast, the specialist, brought the tracker in on a 4-point lead harness, which told me something about how they handled it under normal circumstances. The tracker was Vrethian bred. I recognized the classification from the commission files I used to read when I was still in service. Apex grade. The kind of animal that other apex grade animals gave room to. It was larger than Dusk, heavier, built for a different kind of work. It had a record. I was fairly sure, though those records aren't public. It came through the door at a controlled pace. It crossed 6 meters of cargo floor. Then it stopped. The specialist said something in the Vrethian handler dialect. A command I didn't catch. The tracker didn't move. The specialist said it again. The tracker sat down, slowly, with the deliberateness of an animal making a decision, rather than following an instruction, and it kept its eyes on Dusk in a way that was not threatening, and was not curious, and was something else. The look of an animal that just correctly identified the senior presence in the room and is behaving accordingly. Dusk yawned. It was a long yawn, the kind that ends with a small sound. And then he put his head back down on my boot and closed his eyes. The specialist stood very still. He tried the command a third time, quietly. The tracker's ears moved. Nothing else did. I turned a page on my manifest. The room was not loud. It had been somewhat loud before. The junior detail had been talking among themselves. Orvesh Tan Kalith had been murmuring into a comm. The specialist had been issuing low-register instructions to his animal. None of that was happening now. What was happening was that 6 Rethanethans of varying seniority were standing in a cargo processing bay watching their classified apex grade assessment animal refuse to approach a sleeping 11-year-old German Shepherd. Orvesh Tan Kalith looked at the tracker for a long time. Then he looked at Dusk. Then he looked at me. I had found the line on the manifest I'd been looking for, and I made a note in the margin. He asked me, and there was something different in his voice. Now, not the courtesy and process tone, something quieter. He asked me what Dusk had been certified for, exactly what the work had been, I told him. Search and rescue, primary deployment, urban collapse, wilderness recovery, the occasional mine incident. 11 operational years before the HIP started going. I didn't mention the commendations. They weren't relevant, and I don't mention them unless someone asks twice. Orvesh Tan Kalith didn't ask twice. He stood there a moment longer, and then he said, quietly, that the assessment would be logged as inconclusive, and that the transit documentation would be accepted as filed. He said it to me, but I had the sense he was saying it mostly to himself. The junior certifier with the good command of trade, Common, opened his mouth, and then closed it again. I thanked the duty officer and went back to the manifest. They cleared us through 40 minutes later. Dusk walked out at my left knee, the same pace he always walks, unhurried, taking his time on the ramp. At the threshold he stopped for a moment and turned his head back toward the processing bay, not toward anything in particular, just checking, the way he always does when we leave a room, making sure I haven't left anything behind. Then he turned forward again, and we walked out into the waypost concourse. And he found a patch of floor near the transit bench where the light came through warm from the overhead panels, and he lay down in it and went to sleep. I finished the manifest. He'd already done his part.